Welcome to the Circular Economy podcast by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation.
This is the Circular Economy Show podcast produced by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, where we develop and promote the idea of a circular economy, engage key actors to make it happen, and mobilize system solutions at scale. My name is Maya Adams, and I'm part of the learning team here at the Foundation, and I'll be your host for this episode. In this episode, we'll be speaking about Extended Producer Responsibility, or EPR, and we will hear from Guillermo González, the head of the Circular Economy Office at the Chilean Ministry of Environment, Dr. Maarten Dubois, the project lead of Circular Economy and Plastics at the OECD, Dr. Sara Wingstrand, the program manager of the New Plastics Economy at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and Matthew Demorais, the Global Corporate Affairs Director at Unilever. This conversation was originally moderated by Louise Boyle, the senior climate correspondent from The Independent. Just a reminder, this episode of the Circular Economy Show podcast is based on a recent conversation that we had as part of our Circular Economy Show program. If you'd like to watch the whole show, you can find the link in the episode description. Are you wondering what exactly extended producer responsibility is? Well, today I'm joined by Ambrogio Miserocchi from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's New Plastic Economy team to tell us exactly what that means and why it's important. Hi, Ambrogio.
Hi, Maya.
So, what is a circular economy for packaging?
Well, circular economy for packaging really means that the packaging we place on the market never becomes waste or pollution. And this means that the packaging has to be reusable, recyclable, or compostable in practice and at scale. But when we talk about the circular economy for packaging, there are some steps that we need to keep in mind if we really want to transition to a circular economy. And the different steps are basically to eliminate the packaging we don't need, innovate so that packaging is reusable, recyclable, or compostable. But then we also need to make sure that we keep it in the economy and out of the environment. And this is to circulate the packaging that we place on the market.
Great. So elimination and innovation are the priority stages in achieving a circular economy for packaging. But what if they can't work?
Indeed, that's very true, and it's a very good question. We definitely must eliminate what we don't need and innovate for reusable models, and this is really the priority. But as you said, there might be some circumstances that are not suitable for either elimination or innovation. And when that's the case, we really need to make sure that the packaging and also the packaging materials that we place on the market can be circulated. And you may wonder why this is not already working at scale globally. And the reason is really that there are still challenges to overcome when it comes to collection, sorting, and recycling, composting, or processing of the packaging that we place on the market. And these challenges is what we need to address now.
So could you tell us a little more about those challenges?
Surely. We always need to remember that we need to design the packaging in a way that can be circulated. However, the main challenge is that the economics currently do not stack up. And this means that it costs more to collect, sort, and recycle or compost than the money you make by selling the recycled or composted material. And that is really true for the majority of packaging materials as well as in most geographies. And it's really this unbalance between the cost and the price that is what we need to solve now.
Excellent. So what is the extended producer responsibility and what role can it play in a circular economy for packaging?
As I said, a net cost exists between the process of collection, sorting, and recycling and the price of the recycled materials. And to close this gap, we need funding. And we need funding that is dedicated, ongoing, and sufficient if we really want a solution that works in the long term. And if we look at the three criteria that I just said, so dedicated, ongoing, and sufficient, dedicated means that the funding, the money raised is ring-fenced to activities related to collection, sorting, and recycling of the packaging. Ongoing means that it's guaranteed on an ongoing basis to work in the long term. And then sufficient means that the money is sufficient to achieve the objectives that we want to achieve. And you ask me, what is the role that EPR can play? And when we look at all the options existing out there, we see that mandatory extended producer responsibility is the only proven way to provide such funding. And this is to ensure that the structural economic viability works, and this is required to attract and de-risk the necessary investments to scale the processes for circulating the packaging and the packaging material.
Thanks for that great explain, Ambrogio. So for a listener who doesn't exactly know what extended producer responsibility is, could you give me a quick 30-second crash course on what it is?
Definitely. And I like this because it's a very complex topic. But mandatory EPR, so extended producer responsibility, means that whoever introduces packaging into a country's market remains responsible for that packaging also after its use. And this basically through this mechanism, we create a level playing field for all the stakeholders, and that all the stakeholders are equally responsible for the packaging on the market. And there is one approach, which is the most common approach for mandatory EPR, for packaging. And I can make a very short summary. It basically looks like this. So we have an organization that puts packaging on the market. Then there is a producer responsibility organization, or PRO, that collect the fees from that organization. And then the fees go towards activities related to collection, sorting, and recycling of the packaging. And this is to achieve set targets and set objectives.
Thank you for that explanation. So, for the first time, more than 100 businesses in the packaging value chain and more than 50 other organizations publicly recognize the Extended Producer Responsibility, or EPR. Some of these big endorsers include Danone, H&M, Unilever, Walmart, Tetra Pak, the European Investment Bank, and WWF. Let's hear from Dr. Sara Wingstrand, the program manager of the New Plastics Economy at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, on why this EPR statement is different from the previous work done on EPR.
This statement is important because, first of all, it is the first time that such a large group of stakeholders, as Ambro already mentioned, and such a diverse group of stakeholders are coming together to very explicitly recognize that we need EPR. Otherwise, we will not solve the problem of packaging waste and pollution. We will not create a circular economy overall. Then I think it's also very interesting to note that this group of stakeholders actually include some of the businesses that in the end will take on this responsibility. And they're stepping forward, agreeing with this statement and saying they're ready to take on this responsibility, which is a massive step forward. And especially if we look at, for some of these companies, that was certainly not the case a couple of years ago. So really a massive step forward. And we, of course, hope that this type of statement can be used by governments around the world to actually start a conversation and a dialogue on EPR, to really work out how do we actually design well-designed EPR schemes, how do we implement them, how do we continuously improve, but also really to catalyze the implementation of EPR globally.
Now, what do leading brands and retailers think about EPR? Let's have Unilever's Matthew Demorais take.
I think the starting point really has to be that brands have to take responsibility for their packaging. So, we're not okay with seeing our brands ending up in the environment. But at the same time, when that happens, it's actually wasting, a massive resource to us, which is our packaging. So well-designed EPR systems provide a framework for tackling both of those challenges by asking businesses to effectively pay almost like a service charge, for the collection, the sorting and the processing. And so I'm sure that raises questions as to kind of, why would you want to pay? Why are you putting your hand up? And I think, when you look across the board at the kind of, different policy solutions and other solutions out there, it should be one of the most efficient and effective ways for us to tackle the problem when it's designed correctly. So that rationale is set out in the paper, really clearly, in terms of kind of an ongoing and sufficient funding stream. That, a mandatory system creates a level playing field, which is absolutely critical. But most importantly of all, it drives the right environmental outcomes by putting money into the right places. So one of the phrases I always use is that, money that's raised in the system stays in the system. And that's really critical when you compare it to kind of other measures. So, for instance, if you introduce a tax, there's no guarantee that that money will be used as dedicated funding for things like waste collection and processing. Whereas actually, in an EPR system, that should be the case, as I said, if it's designed correctly. So in theory, those that contribute to the system get a little bit more bang for their buck. And that's really important to us because actually what we want to see are better waste management systems, not only to reduce leakage, but also to drive up recycling rates. Organisations like ourselves, we have really ambitious commitments in terms of the amount of recycled plastic we want to use in our packaging. But that's dependent in terms of kind of the availability and the quality of material that's out there. So in terms of EPR systems being able to help unlock that, that's fantastic. That's what our consumers want to see.
Let's move on to hear a perspective coming from an international organization like the OECD. Here is Dr. Maarten Dubois, the project lead of circular economy and plastics.
Excellent producer responsibility is a game changer in the sense that it creates a market that doesn't exist beforehand. So it's the step from going 0 to 1 that's so difficult, getting the operational system running. Once it runs, you can go from 1, 2, 3, 4. You can refine the system as you want, but it's really about getting the market created. And there are two very nice things about extended producer responsibility. And the first thing is that it's structural. It's economy-wide. It applies to all producers. It's not about, are we going to do something? Let's go, come on, all of you, do it, and do it now. And the second thing is that it's self-sustaining. Once the train of EPR has started, there's no returning. And that's what we see if we look around the world where systems have been implemented. In the first decade, you get enormous performance improvement, but even in the years after, you see further refinements, further extending the scope of EPR to other domains than what was initially meant for. So I think that's the answer. It's one of the few solutions that have such a significant or have the potential to have a significant impact and help to foster circular economy markets.
The metaphor of an EPR train offers an exciting image that the momentum around EPR is gaining. Let's hear more from Dr. Dubois.
It's about making sure that the financial incentives are present. You've got this compliance obligation. Actually, you turn a desire to be sustainable, you turn it into a requirement for your license to operate. If you do not have the necessary recycling capacity installed or contracted as a producer, you simply run out of business. So the whole mindset changes. The structural incentives are there. And that is in a certain way what markets, what people are good at. Once the need is high enough, finding solutions. And that's what you see everywhere. In the beginning, it's always challenging. Once the operational system starts, now suddenly investors are looking at it, companies are making profits. And that's when you get a thriving ecosystem. And that's in a certain way what we all desire and what functions.
Another important piece in the puzzle is government action. The Chilean government in particular has been a trailblazer in implementing circular economy principles and is adopting a national circular economy roadmap as part of its national determined contributions to tackle climate change. It is also the first Latin American country to be part of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's Plastic Pact Network and is currently engaged with implementing EPR regulation. Let's hear more from Guillermo González, the head of the Circular Economy Office at the Chilean Ministry of Environment.
The initial discussions started to take place in Chile in the year 2008 as EPR was being massively deployed in European countries. In 2010, Chile joins the OECD, and one of the commitments that Chile makes is to implement EPR. But that's a commitment that then you need to see in action. And then in that same year, 2010, we had a massive earthquake in Chile in February of 2010, and there was a need for more public revenues. There was a tax reform, and when the tax reform came up, the president said, "Okay, we're going to tax packaging companies in order to fund this." And then packaging companies went like, "Oh no! There's this thing called EPR. Why don't we do that?" And I would say it's exactly for the same reasons that were just mentioned before, because it really you will put money into the system, but you know what the results you're going to get are. In 2013, a bill was sent to Congress by President Piñera, a center-right president. It was approved in the year 2016 by a center-left administration, by President Bachelet's administration. So I think I want to highlight that other point. This has been non-partisan. It's not something that's been an issue of the left or of the right, and there's been a cross-aisle support, which I think is also really important. And in March of this year, we approved the regulation where we actually set the targets. We need EPR, but we need good EPR schemes, right? And in that sense, I think the process, although it took us some time, I think it was worthwhile, because we actually really got to a regulation that is now praised by the public sector, which is really amazing.
Now, let's take a step back and look at the general trends around EPR with Matthew.
in emerging markets in particular, how they're looking at this as potentially as a long-term kind of transition to, a more formalized waste management system. This is not an easy thing to do. We've just heard the discussion about timescales, the devil's in the detail. Every market requires a tailored solution. You cannot drag and drop European systems into other markets. It doesn't work like that. It requires, a lot of that groundwork to be done with the local stakeholders. And the paper acknowledges that there's a role for things like voluntary initiatives as an important step then to learn and inform. And we can see that in markets like Indonesia. So the fact that you're starting to see in places like Southeast Asia, these discussions again kind of rising up is a kind of development. I think the second one would be, in terms of EPR systems, being able to reward the right behaviours. I think Maarten just alluded to it just in his comments as well, which is that you have incentives built in. So, there's conversations within Europe about modulated fees, which is effectively how do the fee structures incentivise the use of recyclable packaging. And so suddenly you're actually driving, the kind of upstream kind of behaviours as well as actually building the infrastructure. And I think finally, the kind of critical part, which we've kind of all covered, is the why is important, which is what this paper covers. But the most critical aspect then is actually how you do this. And, it's amazing, in terms of kind of the amount of shared experience and knowledge we've got across, different organizations. I'm part of a group called the Consumer Goods Forum. And, together there, we've kind of acknowledged the role that EPR can play and actually created some principles as kind of an industry to help inform that process and in discussions with government. Things like we need to have strong environmental outcomes, that it needs to be transparent, accountable. And it builds on the paper that you've got today from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, as it's very much that next stage of the discussion. And it's really exciting to see that you've got this kind of critical mass then coming together. It's no longer just a few organizations who do have that clear point of view.
To this point, Guillermo gives a great example of what's happening in Chile.
I think the plastics, the realization that we have this global plastics problem and that we need to address it in local ways, I think that's really gathered momentum for EPR now. This is, as has been said, this is a public good type of problem. I'm a company, I want to go and collect my packages after they've been used, and how do I do that on my own? It's not something I can do on my own, right? And EPR, as has also been said, generates this level playing field, and so you get everyone on board, and we do it all together, right? I think that it's especially important in countries like ours. Matt said something about this. Emerging economies like Chile, right? What you have is that in some developed nations, it's municipalities that just went and established separate collection schemes and recycling, door-to-door recycling. That's not something that municipalities can do in our countries, So what you have EPR doing here is really deploying this large-scale collection schemes. In our EPR scheme, on top of the targets per ton, we established specific collection targets. This is a 12-year process that will start now, right? But after those 12 years, we will get to 80% of our households in Chile with door-to-door collection, where today it's only about 2%. So it really allows you to tell and that's why I think it's also important, and it's relevant for corporations, because you tell your consumers, this is recyclable, but then you will have a truck going in front of your house taking your recyclable packaging, and that's not something that in our countries municipalities can do on their own. EPR is fundamental. We cannot do it without EPR.
Now, I think it's really interesting to think about what else we need for circular economy for packaging. Sara Wingstrand, the program manager of the New Plastics Economy at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, gives us her take.
EPR traditionally focuses quite downstream on how we collect and actually get the packaging back. We need to make sure that we have the upstream component with us as well. So really focusing on eliminating the packaging we don't need, designing the packaging in a way that it can be circulated, and of course also switching to new delivery models like reuse, for example, that design out waste in the first place. So that's the one thing that we really need. But then also in the paper that we launched today, we also make it very clear that actually EPR is one policy tool, right? But it order to enable a circular economy, you need to have a comprehensive circular economy approach. And there we actually use our universal circular economy policy goals, which is a framework that has been developed by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation to help set out such a comprehensive strategy overall. So we actually use that to take a deep dive into packaging and also go into what are some of the other complementary policies that can also enable a circular economy overall. And then finally, we of course need more businesses to come on board, more voluntary initiatives, and so much more.
Guillermo also agrees with Sara on the need to focus on upstream solutions by looking at how we can eliminate the packaging we don't need, and also at looking at the reuse models that help us keep products and materials in use.
EPR does have some tools to affect what's happening upstream. So we have been looking at state-of-the-art kind of tools like eco-modulated fees, which means that packages that are difficult to recycle will pay more than those that are easy to recycle, right? And we introduced that in our regulation. That's something that's like sort of like in the 2.0 sort of EPR schemes for packaging, and we decided to introduce them straight away. So we sort of like leapfrogged on that issue, and we also introduced something that's quite novel. It's an incentive for companies that can reduce packaging. And I won't go into the details, but it does have some that we do tell companies, if you reduce packaging, unfortunately you're gonna pay less because you pay per ton, right? But this is an additional incentive in order to you to go further, and in that sense you can introduce some devices within EPR regulation to also generate some incentives upstream.
What I'm hearing from this conversation is that collaboration and a range of solutions are needed to stop packaging pollution. Let's hear more from Matthew on how Unilever is making progress.
So I think what we've learned on our journey as Unilever is, there's absolutely no silver bullet. You've got a suite of solutions that are required based on, innovation, collaboration, and execution. Because at the end of the day, we have commitments. We've made, stretching commitments in 2017 and 2019. But actually, what everyone wants to see is real progress, tangible progress. What packaging is changing on shelf. I think the first kind of challenge is kind of considering how do we actually reduce the amount of packaging, the plastic packaging we use in the first instance. So we have a commitment to remove, more than 100,000 tons of plastic packaging. And that's by leveraging new business models like reuse and refill that Sara mentioned. Actually in Chile, where Guillermo is, we've worked with an organization there called Algramo, which is a community-based refill system with kind of smart bottles. And it's based on an app, and people basically can order on their phones. But what we're seeing is, like a 60% repeat rate. So actually it's doing quite well. And if you tailor the responses, you're able to find solutions to be able to take packaging waste out and actually create new ways of engaging with our consumers, which is fantastic. I think in addition to that, it's making sure that the packaging we do use that actually has a value and can be recycled. This was the upstream part that Sara was just mentioning, and that is reliant on technology and new solutions. So toothpaste tubes have obviously, always been quite difficult to recycle. There's kind of, multiple layers to them. And actually what we've seen is, a massive shift. And we recently announced something ourselves around kind of recyclable toothpaste tubes, where you actually go to kind of a single type of plastic, and that makes it easier to recycle. And then finally, it is about getting that collection and processing right. The role that EPR plays is absolutely paramount to that. And I did talk about, we want to use high levels of recycled plastic. That's absolutely, kind of like the foundation, I think, in terms of kind of where we want to be. And so actually unlocking, as I said, the quality, the availability, but also making sure that we can do that at the scale that we need to, for an organization of our size is paramount. And then the only other thing, I completely agree with what Sara said about complementary policy tools. What we need to look at are kind of actually what are the things we need to create some of these broader shifts. So we've mentioned new business models like reuse and refill. There's a huge debate to have there going forward in terms of actually how do we make sure that we normalize those kind of systems, actually kind of how do we change behavior? So is it actually, we need to set, specific targets on those new business models, or are there incentives that we need to help with their development? That's kind of, hugely exciting stuff.
As Matthew has illustrated, there are currently many ways that EPR is influencing packaging collection, sorting, and recycling. It is essential to understand the context, the local expertise, and who the key actors are when implementing EPR, as Matthew has highlighted.
That principle around when you're starting to look at kind of introducing EPR, we've already kind of covered this point, you can't copy and paste it. But I think Maarten said it, the principles are consistent. And what you have, I think, are kind of organizations who have got experience and knowledge and have some of those already formed. So I've mentioned the Consumer Goods Forum, OECD, NGOs like WWF. And it is about building that local coalition. We've got great expertise in certain places that we can come together and actually take, some of those learnings, kind of what works in one market won't necessarily translate, but what you can understand is kind of the process of how they got there. And that there are some basic kind of exercises, actually understanding kind of your material flows, understanding kind of the data that underpins how you actually set, kind of recycling targets, all these different bits and pieces. That's like the groundwork. And then there's kind of a piloting voluntary initiative stage. And then that actually puts you in a position where you can probably implement. So it very much is kind of a step-by-step process.
Guillermo from the Chilean government agrees with Matthew's point on the need to pay attention to local context when looking to implement EPR.
So I think it's important to say why they have to be tailored. And I think that the answer has to do with the fact that EPR is not something that works up in the air. It's something that really has to work with existing institutions and geographies. It's not the same to implement EPR in the Netherlands, a small country, as opposed to Chile, 4,000 kilometers from north to south, with very remote areas. So that those two things are very different. It's very different when you have very active municipalities, as I said before, or very municipalities with very limited capacities. It's very different if you have an informal sector that's really strong, and you need to include them in some way, which is what we did, So the local realities are so different that there's definitely not a one solution here.
And that's all we have time for today. It has been a really interesting conversation with many different complex ideas. So before we leave, Ambro, could you tell us your top 3 takeaways from this conversation?
I think that the first key takeaway is really that there is now broad alignment and that there is this global recognition that the only way to provide dedicated, ongoing, and sufficient funding is through extended producer responsibility schemes. And at the same time, I think it's very much important that now we understand and realize that EPR schemes are a necessary part of the solution to packaging waste and pollution in the transition to a circular economy for packaging. The second one is really that even if we don't have all the answers on how to implement EPR in every single geography around the world, basically not making it work is not an option. So we really need to make it work, and we need to sit down around the table and discuss on how to do it in all geographies. And then there is one last key takeaway that I would like to highlight, and is that now it's clear what the solution we need looks like. Now we really need collaboration for urgent action across the value chain. And in the conversation, it was mentioned the importance of public-private collaboration to make this work. And then the last one that I want to highlight is that now it's clear what the solution we need looks like. Now what we need is really collaboration for urgent action across the value chain. And for example, during the conversation, it was mentioned the importance of public-private collaboration in order to make this work. So we are really going in the right direction to address packaging waste and pollution at its source. And through this approach, we can really accelerate the transition toward the circular economy for packaging.
So as a listener who wants to know more, where should I go to find out about EPR?
Well, we had a very interesting conversation, but of course we touched upon just a few of the elements of the EPR publication that people can find on the Ellen MacArthur Foundation website.
So listeners, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share our podcast to help spread the word. Again, to see the full conversation this podcast is based on, please look up the Circular Economy Show on the Ellen MacArthur Foundation website. Thank you for listening in, and we'll see you next time on the Circular Economy Show podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation Circular Economy podcast. Don't forget to share, rate, and subscribe.